last week of our series called Triggered, and you know, right? You know the kind of people that they trigger you. It's the things they say or the things that they do, some of the people that you work with, some of the people in your neighborhood, or maybe even some of the people that you live with. There's just that thing that they do that just triggers you in a way that, you can feel that frustration rising up in you. And so that's what we've been talking about over the last few weeks, and we've been, having a little fun with it and taking some of the characters from what I think is one of the greatest TV shows of all time, characters from The Office. We looked at Dwight Schrute, Michael Scott, Jim Halpert, and this last week, as we wrap it up, I'm going to take a look at Stanley Hudson. Check it out. Right, and everybody, we've all got some Stanley somewhere in our lives, and you know the kind of person that I'm talking about. It's that person that, they clock in, and they do their job, but they check out mentally by 4:45, physically by 50 or by 5 o'clock. They're the kind of person, they're allergic to enthusiasm. They're immune to motivation. They're the people that you suggest something, and they're just like, good luck with that. Stanleys don't argue, right? They don't fight. They're just disengaged. They're not mad. They're just kind of done with a lot of things in life. And I'm guessing that somewhere in your life, you've got a Stanley. And I'm sure you can see their face right now. You might work with them or you might live with them. They're the ones that they find a downside to every single idea. They're the ones that always have a reason why it's not going to work. And they've, in a lot of ways, built a permanent residence in the land of apathy. And the thing about Stanley then is that, right, on a TV show, it's funny, right? Like The Office, it's funny. But in real life, the Stanleys are not as funny, right? They actually it's heartbreaking to see people live that way, because when someone checks out like that, right, when they stop caring, it's not even because they're lazy. A lot of times it's because somewhere along the way they've been hurt. And somewhere along the way, they've been disappointed probably just one too many times. And that right there, that's how cynicism in any of our hearts, that's how cynicism starts to grow. Because cynicism, it's not something that any one of us are born with. Cynicism, it's something that causes you to trust someone less, to trust people less because you got let down, right? Because I know, right, you've prayed somewhere along the way and nothing happened. Right? You tried to make a difference and you wanted to do this or do that, but it just didn't seem to matter. You've done that enough times so that after a while, you just stop expecting anything to change. After a while, it's just how it goes. Cynicism, for some people, just starts to feel normal. And you convince yourself, you're just like, I'm just being realistic. I'm not angry. I'm just kind of over it. But really, it might just be that you're tired of hoping for something that might not happen. And eventually, maybe you convince yourself that keeping your distance is safer, or staying guarded hurts less than getting your hopes up again. And so we all know, it's somewhere in our lives, we all know a Stanley. But here's, I think, what's harder for any of us to admit, that sometimes I'm Stanley, right? And sometimes, I'm sure, you can be Stanley. Because cynicism, when it comes to cynicism, it just has this sneaky way about it, where it's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's kind of quiet and it's kind of subtle. But if you give it enough time, it has a way of slowly shutting our hearts off to the point where, right, you still show up to things, but you stop caring. You still, want to participate, but you're just kind of there. And so maybe this week isn't about the Stanley at your work or in your school or in your neighborhood or in your home. Maybe it is that just you're Stanley or I'm Stanley. Because cynicism, it's not about a certain personality type. It really comes down to a condition of the heart. It's what happens when disappointment goes unhealed. Because again, I know you've prayed prayers and experienced where, at least the way you saw it, nothing changed. You've trusted people, right? You've trusted people and they let you down. You've served faithfully and still had things in your life fall apart. And so somewhere along the way, maybe you just decided, well, I'm done getting my hopes up. And you didn't quit. You just stopped expecting. That maybe you used to pray bold prayers, but now you just kind of scroll, right? You used to show up on a Sunday morning expectant, but now you just show up. You used to believe that, well, hey, God could, but now you're not so sure. You're still in the room, but your heart isn't. And I want to tell you that if that's you, and maybe if that's a place where you're at, or maybe something that you've been through or going through, I want you to know that I get it. I think people in my line of work are more at risk of being Stanleys than maybe many others, because ministry just has a way of wearing you down. Because I could stand up here and celebrate life change on a Sunday morning, but then by Thursday I'm in a meeting with someone upset about a Facebook post. Right? I've watched people sign up for groups and sign up to serve and then disappear when it's inconvenient. I've prayed with people, right? As we begged God to do a miracle, and sometimes I've experienced this, you've experienced this. Sometimes instead of a miracle, I ended up standing at a funeral. And somewhere in there, I think that's where cynicism whispers, hey, why bother? Nothing really changes. For us, right? I just got to get through a Sunday. And it's so easy for our hearts to start to drift. And so, man, I get Stanley. And no matter what line of work that you're in, no matter how great things might even be going in your life right now, it's so easy for any single one of us to fall into that pattern of cynicism. Because it's just part of the human story. It's what happens when the pain of life catches up to our faith. That when you've believed or you've prayed and you served and you still found out at the end of the day, things fell short of what you thought, or things fell apart. And this isn't a 21st century struggle. Long before email threads and Facebook comments, people wrestled with the same weariness of heart. I mean, the Bible is full of people, full of stories of people who trusted God and yet still ended up disappointed or not happy with their circumstances. People who even wondered, are you even with me? And one of those people that I want to specifically talk about today is Naomi. Now, Naomi, we find her story in the Old Testament, and Naomi's not famous. She's not a prophet. She's just an ordinary person whose life completely fell apart. What happened was, for Naomi, there was a famine in the city of Bethlehem. And so Naomi and her husband, they did maybe what we would do. They packed up. They moved to another community, moved to another country. They were just looking for some stability. They ended up in a place called Moab. And for a while, things were okay. They made a life for themselves there. They had 2 sons. Her sons then got married. Life finally settled down a little bit. That famine was, that was in the past. That was back in Bethlehem. And their future looked fairly steady. I'm sure for Naomi, when she kind of looked at her life, she felt, we made it, right? We're good. But then everything that could go wrong did. Naomi's husband died. Both of Naomi's sons died. And so all that's left is just Naomi, and now she has 2 daughters-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. So she decides, well, man, my husband's gone. My boys are gone. I have no provision. I have nothing. And so she decides, well, I might as well go back home to Bethlehem. She's heard that the famine is over and might as well go back. I've got nothing for me here. And so she tells her daughters-in-law, she says, hey, I want you to go back to your families. I want you to start over somewhere else, some other way. Don't stay tied to me, but they don't want to leave. But Naomi insists, and this is what she says. She says, things are far more bitter for me than for you. And she says this, that it's because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me. I mean, man, that's some honesty. She is not pretending. She is bitter towards God. Naomi feels like God is, for some reason, done with her, and she is not hoping for anything new happening in her life. And so Orpah, what happens is she kisses Naomi goodbye, and she goes home. But Ruth, her other daughter-in-law, she says, I'm staying. She clings to Naomi, and this is what she says. She says, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I go. Wherever you live, I live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And so, again, with nothing left in Moab, Naomi and Ruth, they start their journey back towards Bethlehem. When they arrive, right, all those people that used to know Naomi, they kind of got excited and they're asking, is Naomi back? Is she back? But look at how she responds. She says, don't call me Naomi. Don't call me Naomi. Instead, I want you to call me Mara. for the Almighty, for God has made life very bitter for me. I mean, that right there, that's cynicism with a heartbeat. She's just empty. She's not fighting God. She's just stopped believing that God's still at work. And it's really interesting that name that she says, call me Mara, in the Hebrew language, that name means bitter. It means bitter. And right, isn't that what cynicism can do? It takes disappointment and turns it into an identity. Naomi is not just describing how she feels when she says, call me Mara. She's redefining who she is, because when pain sits unhealed long enough, it starts to name you. And maybe you felt that very thing, that when you just stopped trying to fix it and you just said, I'm just gonna live with the pain. But Naomi, she continues, she says, I went away full. I left Bethlehem. I went away full. Things were good, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me? Now, in the Hebrew language, names carried a lot more significance. And Naomi, her name means pleasant. Right? So she says, don't call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant anymore. That's not me. She is convinced her story is over, that the best parts of life behind her. She says, no, call me bitter, call me Mara, because I don't even know Naomi anymore. And that's how she sees herself. Empty, forgotten, finished. And I just think that's what disappointment can easily do if we don't deal with it. Where it starts small, it's a few unmet expectations, maybe a couple unanswered prayers. But if not dealt with over time, that seeps deeper until you're not just feeling better, but you're becoming that you are bitter. You start naming yourself by what's happened to you. You stop saying, oh, you know what? No, that was a tough season. And you start saying things like, well, that's just kind of who I am now. You stop saying, you know what? That job just didn't work out. And start saying things like, well, I guess maybe I'm just not cut out for that. You stop saying that relationship hurt me. And you start saying things like, I'm never going to trust anybody ever again. And that's where Naomi's story could have ended. Bitter, empty, convinced that God was done with her life. And so it says this, that Naomi, she returned from Moab. She was accompanied by her daughter-in-law, Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. Again, Naomi gets back to Bethlehem, thinks her story's over, right? She left everything. She's alone. All she has is Ruth, no husband to take care of her. In that culture, that was crucial. She's convinced that she's come back home empty. But the writer there slips in that little line that says they arrived in Bethlehem in the late spring as the barley harvest was beginning. And that might sound like a timestamp. Like the writer is saying, oh, by the way, it's late spring. See that little detail there, it's more than that. Because, right, remember back in chapter 1, those first few voices, when Naomi left Bethlehem, why'd she leave? Because of a famine, right? The land was empty. And now we're told that she comes back and the harvest is starting. And it's the writer's way of saying, hey, pay attention. Something's shifting. The season's changing. There's no miracle yet, right? We haven't seen anything happen. It's just a small, quiet sign that life is starting to grow again. And the same soil that once had famine, now it holds grain. And look at what Ruth does. Ruth gets up one day and says, you know what? I'm just going to go out into the harvest fields. I'm going to pick up some stalks of grain, the ones that are left behind by anyone who's kind enough to let me do it. Ruth decides to do this, and she doesn't know how this is going to turn out, but when she does, she just takes one small step. One small step. And that's what I love about Ruth, because sometimes the most spiritual thing that you can do is just keep showing up. You bend down, you gather what's right in front of you. And you trust that somehow, even in the ordinary, that God is still at work. And here Ruth isn't chasing a miracle. She's just doing the next right thing. And in doing that, what happens is she walks into a field that's owned by a man named Boaz. And what's significant about Boaz, he's not just another farmer. He's family. And in that culture, this detail matters so much because, right, when the husband, the man of the house died, it was devastating. And we're not just talking emotionally. We're talking economically. When a husband died, the family's land, their livelihood, their legacy, that was all tied to the man's name. If he died without a son, everything could be lost. Property, family name, even their place in the community. There was no safety net, no insurance policy, but what God did, he built something into his law called the kinsman redeemer. And a kinsman redeemer was a close relative who had the right and, more importantly, the responsibility to step in and buy back the land that was lost, to restore the land and to carry on the family name, to protect anything that had been broken. It was a picture of grace that was built right into God's law for his people. And so when Ruth, she's just out there gathering grain in Boaz's field, it might seem like it's a coincidence, but this really is providence. And Naomi doesn't see it yet. Ruth doesn't even know it yet, but God is already weaving redemption into the ordinary. And I think that's why I love this story. While they're just, right, Naomi and Ruth, they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to get by. But in the middle of that, God is preparing to redeem their situation. And maybe that's where you are right now. You're doing your best, right? You're trying, you just keep showing up. It's frustrating and you're not seeing results. You're kind of bending down, picking up what's right in front of you, and you're even wondering, does God, do you even notice? But what if that's where redemption, exactly where redemption begins? Not in the dramatic, but in the daily. Not in the spotlight, but in the small, faithful steps that probably nobody else sees. But then when something shifts, Ruth comes home that day with her arms full. Way more grain than she was expected to just, pick up in the field that day. Naomi looks at her probably stunned because she can't believe how much grain that Ruth has. And she says, where did you get all that grain? Whose field were you working in? And Ruth says, well, I was, in Boaz's field. And at that point in the story, you can almost feel the atmosphere of the story change. Because that name, the name of Boaz, it means something. And there it stirs something in Naomi that she thought was gone. Look at what she says. She says, may the Lord bless him, Boaz. He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers. Interesting, the same woman that said, God raised his fist against me. Call me Mara, I'm bitter. That's who I am. As she sees this happen and hears about Boaz and sees the grain, there's just a tiny bit of hope there. Now, nothing about her circumstances has really changed. She's still a widow. They're still fighting to survive. They don't know how this story is going to end. Their losses aren't magically undone, but something inside Naomi begins to shift. Naomi begins to see even in the middle of her pain, hey, God might be up to something. God's kindness might not have left me like I thought it did. And I think that's how cynicism breaks. Not through a miracle, not through everything even being fixed or solved, but through one small glimpse of grace that reminds you, hey, you know what? Maybe God is at work. Maybe God's closer than I thought he was. And I just wonder how many of us are like Naomi right now. Here we are just trying to survive this season. Here we are just trying to get through the hand that we've been dealt. And in the middle of it, it might just be that God has been at work, that he's been at work in the ordinary faithfulness, the barely noticed kinds of daily things. Maybe it was in a conversation you almost didn't have. It was in that person that hasn't left your side, or it was maybe in that field that you didn't realize that you were standing in. Because the truth is, God's work in our lives, it doesn't always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it just shows up in that quiet, simple, in the middle of an ordinary day kind of way. So maybe the question today isn't, well, can God still move in my life? Maybe the question is, have I been paying attention? Now, we don't have time to get into all the remaining story for Naomi, but what's so amazing to me is that Naomi, she had no idea of what God was setting in motion. But Ruth ends up marrying Boaz. They have a son. They name him Obed. Obed is the father of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David. And you know David, right? He was the great king over Israel. And generations later, if you were to open up your Bibles to the beginning of the New Testament, Matthew's account of Jesus' life, Matthew starts his account of Jesus' life with a genealogy. And right there in the middle of all those names, you'll come across Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother, it says specifically, whose mother was Ruth. To me, that's what makes Ruth's story so incredible. Because on the surface, right, it's so small, right? It's not a story about, great ancient battles or prophets, and God didn't part the sea here. This story is about two widows that were just trying to get by. Two widows that were just trying to survive. A story that shouldn't even seem, in the grand scope of things, shouldn't even necessarily be in Scripture, but to me, that's exactly why it's there. Because it shows us that God's redemption doesn't just happen in palaces or through power. It happens many times in the fields, in the quiet, in the faithfulness of ordinary people who just keep showing up. So I was originally, this last week, I was going to pick a different character from The Office. Angela. If you know Angela, she's the self-righteous, very judgmental Christian. And I thought, that there's some stuff there, I can pull some stuff out, and I think it'd be good. But I kept coming back to Stanley because I just felt like this topic is important for any of us, because cynicism is not loud. It's subtle. It creeps in when you feel like you stop seeing God at work. And I think that's where so many people find themselves. Even yesterday, I got a call from a pastor friend of mine, and he texted me and said, "Hey, can we talk?" So I gave him a call, and he just started to talk about some of the things that he was struggling in his church. And essentially, as we got through the conversation and processing a little bit, I was like, you got a bunch of Stanleys in your church. Like, you just got a church full of Stanleys that are just negative, and they don't see, any hope or any kind of future. And he told me, he said, my people are just saying, it feels like the church died years ago, Pastor, before you ever got here. They said, oh man, it just feels like our community is dying, and we just don't see much hope at all. They just a bunch of Stanleys. And I told my friend, I said, hey, just give me a couple days. I just need to process it. I want to talk through this with you. And this morning, as I was getting ready, it just kind of hit me. I just was like, you know what? The thing I know I need to tell him is that, hey, you got to show your people where God is still moving. You got to show your people that God is still working in their lives. It might be small. You got to show your people that God is still working in your church, that God is still moving, even if it's in some small ways. You got to do everything you can to make sure that they see that God is still working in their community. Because when all you see is what's wrong, you're going to stop believing that anything is right. And I just wanted him to see, like, hey, you got to make sure that they see that God is moving. And Naomi, right, she thought everything around her was dead. But God was already writing redemption into her story. And I just wonder if maybe that's true for you this morning. You walked in this morning, and certainly there's some things in your life, not everything's fixed. Not everything even makes sense. But maybe you need to see that God is moving. That it might be small, it might be hard to even notice, but yet he's still working in some small, faithful, subtle ways in the middle of whatever you might be dealing with now. Would you do me a favor, just right where you're at? I want to close. If you just bow your heads. And I just want to ask a couple questions. And this is just a chance for you to reflect a little bit on maybe that and maybe where you're at. Maybe if you've kind of drifted into that, Stanley kind of life, that's cynicism. And let me ask this. Where have you started lowering your expectations of God? And, what's happened? What have you gone through that maybe has caused you to lower your expectations of God? Next question. Who's your Ruth? Who's your Ruth? It might just be that there's somebody walking beside you, and they've been walking beside you, and you just couldn't see hope. But that God's been trying to use them to point you to where He's been working and where He's been moving. Who's your Ruth? Last question. I get it. Some of you, right? You're good. God's good. He's been moving. You see it. But we can all end up as a Stanley. All end up like Naomi. No, don't call me Naomi. Call me bitter. We can all end up there very easily. Some unanswered prayers, some tough circumstances, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a place where you just don't feel any hope. So what do you need to do to guard your heart against that? What do you need to do to guard your heart against that bitterness? How can you stay aware? How can you stay grateful and expectant even when life doesn't go as planned? And I want to do this. If maybe you're in that season, and right now you, with whatever you're going through, you see little hope. You feel like you're trying to, God, I want to see what you're doing. I just don't feel like you're doing anything. I don't feel like you're working. I just don't feel you. I feel kind of like Naomi, and I'm feeling a little bitter. If with heads bowed, eyes closed, if that's you, just so I can know how to pray, who to pray for, would you just put your hand up right where you're at? See, if that's me, I'm in that season. Dear Heavenly Father, for those that raise their hands, God, I pray that you would, this week, maybe open their eyes to what you've been doing. Open their eyes to where you've been working, to that situation, in that struggle or that roadblock maybe that they've hit. God, I pray that you would help them to see where you've been at work. God, in the meantime, while they're waiting for their own redemption story, for their own, you working things out, God, I pray that they would just continue to put their trust in you, put their hope in you, knowing, God, that you are at work, and that they'd be, in some ways content in the middle of the difficulty, knowing that, God, you are there, that you haven't abandoned them. And with heads bowed and eyes closed, just want to do this real quick. Maybe Naomi's your story in the sense that, right, maybe that's why you walked away from faith. You're just bitter. You're bitter that God didn't act, or God didn't answer, or God hasn't shown up like you thought he would, and you've kind of walked away from your faith, or maybe that's why you never took that step to begin with, because you just didn't see how it all fit into your life. You just need to know that your Heavenly Father loves you, that he's been there, always will be. And in fact, he loves you so much, he sent his son to die on a cross for you. And if you've walked away from faith, or maybe you've never taken that step, it can start with a simple prayer that you can pray right now, something like, Dear Heavenly Father, thank you. Thank you for your work in my life. Help me to see it when I can't. Thank you for sending your son to die on a cross. Forgive me of my sins, and today I choose to follow you. And so God, this morning, I pray. God, I pray that we would see your work. But even if we don't, and even if we're struggling, God, I pray that there just be moments where we just keep pressing into you, that we just do the next right step in front of us. We take care of what we need to take care of. And then that step that we just trust you. Trust that you're working. So God, we love you. We praise you. Amen.